Hey everyone, today's lecture is going to be about psychoanalysis. Normally in class, this is a 2-day lecture, so today is just going to be a quick run through, a nice review of some of the big concepts that we talk about when talking about psychoanalysis. You may recall that psychoanalysis was started by this guy, Sigmund Freud. He's what we call the father of psychoanalysis. And Freud has a real interesting history. Freud kind of started his career as a psychologist when in the process of traditional medicine, he came across patients that were exhibiting physical symptoms without any physical causes. And Freud believed that the cause, the problem, must reside in the mind. And so Freud develops this theory of the unconscious mind. And essentially, what he does is he equates the mind to an iceberg. You may recall that this symbol is used because only a fraction of your mind is above the surface, what we call consciousness. And in consciousness, those are things that you can think about right now, that you can tell someone, that you could write in a journal. And just beneath that surface is what we call the preconscious mind. These are things that you can easily recall. So if I were to say something like, think about your most embarrassing moment. Well, you probably weren't thinking about that beforehand, but now some memories are coming to mind, and you may actually start to feel embarrassed once again, right? And have some physiological changes in your body as you recall this particular memory. So those are parts of your preconscious mind. But if you think about an iceberg, the majority of the iceberg is beneath the surface. And Freud says that that's just like our mind, that the majority of our mind is beneath the surface in what he calls our unconscious mind. Those are parts of our mind that we are largely unaware and yet still have an impact on our everyday thoughts and feelings and behaviors. And so your unconscious mind would be made up of drives that you have and these impulses, these real basic impulses that we have as humans. They're made up of experiences from childhood that we no longer can recall and can think about. So you likely, for example, don't have any memories of when you were 2 or 3 years old and the relationships that you had with family members and friends and different experiences that took place and how people treated you. And yet, Freud is going to argue that those experiences can impact your everyday life. And he talks about these throughout these stages that we go through, what he calls the psychosexual stages of development. And those include things like when you are trying to wean off of breastfeeding or bottle feeding, or children who are used to sucking on that pacifier every night to go to sleep. And Freud says that we have these big obstacles and experiences of the experience of overcoming having to fall asleep with a pacifier, the experience of trying to become potty trained, right? We might not remember those experiences from childhood, but Freud argues that they impact our daily life as adults. And so if there are problems that exist, we need to try to tap into that unconscious mind, try to think about those experiences, and see if we can resolve them. So I don't want to go into any many more details about psychosexual stages, just because most of those questions are multiple choice questions, and there's usually like one. They're not very common on the FRQ. We sometimes see terms like fixation if you get stuck in a stage. We'll sometimes see things like identification, and that's when you start to kind of relate to your same-sex parent. In fact, their values and beliefs become your conscience, according to Freud. But beyond that, we're not going to go into too much more detail. But speaking of conscience, how you ought to behave, your id, ego, and superego. These are parts of your mind where Freud says as a child, you're really driven by your id. You can remember you're driven by the id when you're a kid, and the id is impulsive. The id says, I want that and I want it right now. And it's what we call your pleasure principle. And then around 6 years old or so, 6 or 7, you start to develop a conscience, like how you ought to behave, how society thinks you should behave. And Freud calls this your superego. And balancing these two is your reality principle, what Freud calls the ego. And the ego tries to satisfy the needs of the id or the desires of the id, but do so in a socially acceptable way as defined by the superego. Now, after Freud, there were a number of people that liked some elements of his psychoanalytic theory, but they abandoned some of the more kind of fringe, extreme aspects. And we consider these people neo-Freudians or new Freudians. Neo-Freudians, they believe in the unconscious mind. They believe in defense mechanisms, which we're going to get to in our next slide. But they don't necessarily believe some of the stuff like all of our actions are driven by sex and aggression. They don't believe things like necessarily the Oedipus complex, where young boys want to grow up and marry their mothers and have this strong resentment against their fathers. And so Neo-Freudians, they they include people like Alfred Adler, who writes a lot about inferiority complex and trying to behave in ways that make you feel on par with other people, especially siblings. They include people like Karen Horney, who really challenges Freud's idea of sex driving our behavior and believes more so of social interaction and things like that. And they include Carl Jung, spelled Jung, and Jung's idea of the collective unconscious mind, and how there are some aspects of our unconscious mind that are perhaps passed down by parents and grandparents and through generations. And so those are just a few examples of Neo-Freudians. Defense mechanisms. Remember, your defense mechanism is essentially your ego's attempt to protect yourself from uncomfortable negative emotions. And so if you're feeling angry or embarrassed, you may deploy a defense mechanism to help you kind of cope with this particular scenario. I've got a bunch of them listed there. These should all be in your notes. I'm going to run through them really quickly. So repression is kind of at the root of all defense mechanisms. The idea behind repression is that we try to push these uncomfortable experiences into our unconscious mind so that we don't have to think about them. Sublimation is when we convert a negative energy into a positive energy. So if you're really angry with someone, instead of yelling at them and cursing at them and maybe trying to fight them, you try to go for a run to get out that negative energy. Or maybe you write a song on your guitar about how mad you are at this particular person. Rationalization is just coming up with excuses, right? Trying to justify your behavior. Displacement sometimes trips students up. The idea behind displacement is you are angry at one particular person, or you're upset with one particular person, but you displace it to someone else. So maybe I'm really angry with the principal, my boss, but I don't want to yell at my boss, right? So I go back in the classroom, I start yelling at you all. So I've displaced that emotion to someone else. Projection, students confuse displacement with projection all the time. The idea behind projection is I feel something, but I project and claim it's what you feel. And so I believe a relationship is going to fail, but as I'm talking to someone else, I say, you don't have any confidence in this relationship. So I'm projecting to you how I really feel. And then reaction formation is overcompensating and essentially acting in a completely opposite way of how you really believe. And so you're really angry with a friend and they ask you about it and you're like, no, I'm not angry at all. Everything's just fine. And so the reaction formation is to say or behave opposite of how you truly feel. And then this is the last slide. So the idea is with projective tests, we talk about these experiences, these memories in our unconscious mind. Well, how do we know what's going on in the unconscious mind? Like, how do we tap into that? Well, Freud would write about things like hypnosis. He'd write about things called free association, where he would say a word and you just start talking about the first thing that comes to your mind. And some of these projective tests help with the process of free association. They help with the process of you just talking and then eventually start spilling out experiences from your unconscious mind. They both include ambiguous stimuli, meaning something that doesn't have like a clear-cut answer. Rorschach ink blots, I have an example here. Ink blot on a slide, you start just talking about what you see, and perhaps through this kind of jumble of words, you start talking about things that you otherwise would not have planned to talk about. And the TAT is what we call the thematic apperception test. Those are ambiguous pictures of people in different places, and you don't know who they are, what they're doing, but through the process of you telling the story, right? Well, I think this is this person and they're doing this particular thing. You may reveal parts of your unconscious mind. You remove a filter and you start saying things that with conscious choice, you maybe would not have said. And so projective tests, they try to tap into that unconscious mind, see if anything funky is going on. So real quick, I hope that helped. Psychoanalysis can be a little tricky. If you have questions, and I wouldn't be surprised if you do, be sure that you shoot me an email, and best of luck.